how is it that psychiatric illness, take major depression, is ever escalating? It's the number one cause of disability worldwide, according to the WHO. How is that the case if we also have ever escalating access to treatment? We have more people taking psychotropics today than ever before in human history. Shouldn't that be resulting in diminished, at least, disability rates? Why are they escalating in tandem? Medication is actually driving epidemics of disabling mental illness.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 122, and my guest is Dr. Kelly Brogan. Kelly is the author of the international and New York Times bestselling book, A Mind of Your Own, and she is the co-editor of the landmark book, Integrative Therapies for Depression. She completed her psychiatric training and fellowship at NYU Medical Center after graduating from Cornell University Medical College, and she has a Bachelor of Science from MIT in Systems Neuroscience. She is a holistic women's health psychiatrist with a practice in Manhattan. Obviously, Kelly is an expert on the topic of mental health and depression in particular. She challenges how we view mental illness, its root causes, and treatments. She suggests, for example, that depression is a symptom, not a disease, and that the best way to heal the mind is to heal the body first. Before we get into the conversation, we want to let you know about a special deal this month. It is the Weston A. Price Foundation's March Membership Madness. You can become a member of the foundation, supporting its important work, including this podcast, by the way, for only $30. That's a $10 savings over regular membership. Join in March by going to westonaprice.org and clicking on the Member Yet button. The Weston A. Price Foundation is helping you and the world eat better. And Sauna Space, the sauna for every body. Sauna Space is the maker of incandescent-based, full-spectrum, EMF-shielded portable sauna solutions. Handcrafted with love in the USA. Go to saunaspace.com and use the coupon code WISETRADITIONS, all caps, one word, for 10% off at checkout. That's Sauna Space, the sauna for every body, at saunaspace.com. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Kelly.
Total pleasure to be here.
I am excited to dig into the contents of your book, A Mind of Your Own, because I just finished participating in Dr. Mark Hyman's series, The Broken Brain. Did you hear about that?
I did, yes. Exciting.
It is exciting. More and more people are realizing there is something to these psychological issues that we're having and how we can maybe approach them with nutrition and alternative methods. But I want to start with you, Kelly. Tell us your story. How did you get into this whole field of treating depression in a different way?
I come from a very conventional family, very much believers in the authority of the medical model. And I myself was, a huge proponent of the pill-based cure. And as is the case for so many physicians who ultimately turn their back on conventional medicine, the portal for me was my own diagnosis. So my first health problem, right? And before then, I never really knew what it was like to walk in the shoes of a patient. And so the pharmaceutical model seemed to make a lot of sense. It seemed like it was reasonably science-based and like there was a linear progression from diagnosis to treatment and then a better experience of life. But when I was confronted with that model, I chose to opt out. And so it was through my postpartum diagnosis of Hashimoto's thyroiditis that I discovered naturopathy, and I discovered that lifestyle matters. And I watched my own pretty horrifying labs on paper move very seamlessly into the normal range. And all that I was doing was changing the way I was living, examining my habits, and I felt like a totally different person. So that was my big aha.
And when did you decide to explore possibilities with depression in particular?
So because my sort of point of entry was actually the immune system, this is an autoimmune condition that happens to have its primary impact on the endocrine system, I began to come upon a whole new body of literature called psychoneuroimmunology, right? Which is essentially just speaking to the fact that all of these different disciplines that we heretofore imagined were totally separate and distinct, like requiring different specialists,
Hmm.
are actually linked in a web-like manner so that the gut, immune system, hormones, and brain-based neurochemistry are all in dialogue. And so this idea of having given specialists addressing this brain up problem began to seem more and more suspect to me. I began to learn because I hit the books essentially through my own health experience. I went back to PubMed and I said, listen, no one ever told me that modifying my diet would result in remission of an autoimmune condition. So what else didn't they tell me? I spent years nearly obsessively reading the primary literature myself. So learning everything I could about different pharmaceutical products and undisclosed risks, learning about the science-based evidence for natural healing, and learning about this sort of new frontier in thinking around biology, that invokes these really radical concepts like epigenetics and biochemical individuality and the role of our inner ecology or the microbiome. And it turned out that there was like decades of literature on this, and I'd never heard of it. I thought that was so interesting until I discovered a convenient statistic, which is that it takes 17 years on average for primary science to trickle into clinical translation, to make it to your doctor's office. So our standard of care is really outdated by the time we even get to our doctor's appointment. And so I began to sort of try and distill and curate this information for people to use on their own. And it wasn't until I read a book that changed my life. Colleague gave it to me and she said, Kelly, what do you think about this? You prescribe a lot of these meds. And the book is called Anatomy of an Epidemic. It's by investigative journalist Robert Whitaker. And I had just had my healing experience, just encountered all this inspiring science, and it ignited a lot of curiosity on my part around everything I hadn't been told. And here lands in my lap a book that basically, in my opinion, drives the nail in the coffin of psychiatric prescribing, because he basically poses a question. He says, well, how is it that psychiatric illness, right? So take major depression, is ever escalating, right? It's the number one cause of disability worldwide, according to the WHO. How is that the case if we also have ever escalating access to treatment, right? We have more people taking psychotropics today than ever before in human history. Shouldn't that be resulting in diminished, at least, disability rates? Why are they escalating in tandem? So it seems like a relatively innocent question, but then he goes on to provide just reams of non-industry funded data to support the very provocative suggestion that medication is actually driving epidemics of disabling mental illness. The way it hit me was when I finished that book, I remember crying on the subway in Manhattan, literal like tears coming down my face, because I just watched my entire training, go down the drain. And I never started a patient on a prescription again. This was almost a decade ago.
Oh my. So he's saying that the very act of getting these people on these psychotropics is causing the epidemic to spread more, but aren't we just seeing more and more depression and treating it?
Both are true. In my experience, people are manifesting symptoms, right? And we manifest them differently, right? So your cancer, her diabetes, his bipolar disorder, that are a very meaningful response to imbalance. On a physiologic level, that we call that imbalance inflammation. So we have all of these diseases of modern civilization that are literally taking down our GDP dollar by dollar. And we are theorizing around them as being distinct disease entities, but really they are just slight variations on a theme. We are living out of sync with our inbuilt genetic expectations. In the research, it's called evolutionary mismatch. I know that's probably a concept very familiar to your listeners who are aware that we've wandered off the path in a pretty serious way in terms of the way that we wake up, eat, think, expose ourselves to sunlight, or don't move, sleep, relate. So there is a very real signal of distress. It is meaningful. The words I've used are that it's an invitation. But what happens is that we assume, at least in the realm of psychiatry, that these are actual disease entities rather than largely non-specific expressions of distress, homeostasis, inflammation, imbalance, right? And of course, on a spiritual level, they're highly specific. But on a biological level, it's just an expression of a lack of being in sync. So the mistake is made when we don't have the nuance, when we don't have the sophisticated clinical inquiry, when we don't know how to approach these complex problems, and instead we fit them in to a convenient template of psychiatric labeling. I mean, maybe, I'm guessing most of you know that psychiatry doesn't involve any testing at all. So there's no blood testing, there's no EEG testing, there's no cerebrospinal fluid levels, there's no neurochemistry assessment, there's nothing. It's an impressionistic conversation, and you are often assigned a label that you can retain for the rest of your life sometimes, right? And that label has tremendous impact on your sense of self, your personal identity, and the lens through which you experience your own life and associated limitations, right? Mm-hmm. So the problem arises when, instead of saying, okay, something really is wrong on this planet, people are really struggling in pretty serious ways. What is that about? Why? Like, can we ask the question why, rather than just trammeling over, the whole presentation and saying, well, this is what's going on, hand waving around neurochemical imbalance and some sort of question of genetic susceptibility, and then putting people on prescription management in perpetuity.
Is this why you say in your book that depression is not a disease? Because you're also saying that's a label that's inappropriate.
I do feel that way. It's more something like a fever, because we look at a fever and we don't really know from the fever itself what's driving it or what to do about it. We have to investigate that. So in that way, it's a symptom. It's a collection of symptoms, which is called syndrome, but by no means is actually any diagnosis in psychiatry, from schizophrenia to OCD to bipolar disorder to ADHD, a verified scientific biological entity. And this is where psychiatry really deviates from other branches of medicine, where we say, okay, so what's diabetes? We don't say it's when you're really thirsty and you have to pee a lot and you have to take insulin, right? We say, oh, it's a sort of imbalance in insulin management of blood sugar levels, and this is the physiology, and this is what we've best understood is the way to intervene. Not that I think diabetes is not amenable to lifestyle interventions, but nonetheless, there is a physiologic mechanism that we have elucidated that is the sort of biology that is verifiable from patient to patient. In psychiatry, we say, well, what is depression? And we say, oh, well, it looks like this, and here's what you do about it. There is absolutely no mechanistic understanding of what it is. And that was a big aha for me, because when I looked through about 60 years of research, assuming that depression had something to do with the serotonin imbalance, I was pretty shocked to learn that there's literally not a shred of valid evidence to support that, to the extent that actually over the past 20 years, the whole notion of what's called the monoamine hypothesis has been completely abandoned in lieu of what's called the cytokine theory, which is, what we were just talking about, this inflammatory model.
So you just used a couple terms that went over my head. They might go over the listeners too, but what I get, the grain of what I'm getting of what you're saying, tell me if this is right, is that there isn't scientific proof that demonstrates where depression is stemming from.
Yeah.
But according to your investigations, and maybe a link that's going to eventually get out there to the public, the gut microbes and inflammation have a lot to do with our mental health.
Yes, certainly not all the time, right? Because you could take the example of your toe hurting, right? Like your toe hurts, it could be a hammer dropped on it, it could be a string tied around it too tight, it could be an infection in the toenail. Everyone's experience of these symptoms requires personalization, right? So depression can have many, many drivers, ranging from, nutrient deficiency, like a B12 deficiency, for example, from, wrong diet, for example, or taking an acid blocking drug for a long period of time, all the way to, an endocrine disruption like hypothyroidism, all the way to a psychospiritual emergence, It's an amazing detail that in our current iteration of the diagnostic manual in psychiatry, which is this growing book of labels of what is not normal, the bereavement clause was lifted so that if you are exhibiting symptoms of depression for more than 2 weeks after the loss of a loved one, you could be a candidate for medication-based treatment. The implication being that something is wrong with you when you experience that kind of grief that is protracted beyond 2 weeks, right?
Mhm.
So the range of what we are labeling as a disease encompasses so many important factors of wise response on the part of the body, mind, and soul that we need to begin to dive in to your story personally.
Coming up, we discuss with Kelly the simple things we can do to mitigate the factors that lead to the gut microbe issues that can affect our physical and mental health. We pause now to remind you that it is March Membership Madness. When you become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation, you become a part of a like-minded community. With an extensive, comprehensive website, easy access to pasture-raised food, you support the raw milk movement and this weekly podcast. I could go on, and I will for just a minute. You also get 4 quarterly journals that are jam-packed with pictures and valuable health information. You get our shopping guide, helpful trifold brochures about specific health topics, and access to our members-only Facebook group. There is so much more, so join today for only $30. Go to westonaprice.org and click on the Member Yet button. And Sauna Space. Sauna Space has the sauna for every body. Sauna Space crafts modern product solutions that bring ancestral light therapy and heat therapy to all, with accessible and flexible design. Experience the rejuvenating power of ancestral healing in the convenience of your own home with Sauna Space. They harness the unique combination of natural, near-infrared light and heat therapy, delivering full-body healing and detoxification. I just started using my single panel light every night, and I love it. It just feels like a warm embrace before I go to bed, and I know that it's helping regenerate my cells on a deep level. So check it out, and all Sauna Space products exhibit beautiful craftsmanship and are backed by a lifetime warranty. Go to saunaspace.com, and you can use the coupon code WISETRADITIONS, all caps, one word, for 10% off at checkout. You can also just visit their website for more on the healing science of incandescence. That's saunaspace.com. What are some things we can do to mitigate these factors that are leading us to these problems with our gut microbes and inflammation in the body?
So what I found was I was able to translate my own healing experience, so my lived experience of recovery and remission, into something that I could then pass on to those who are otherwise struggling with psychiatric symptoms or, struggling around overwhelm even. So ranging from malaise all the way to what would be considered major mental illness. And even though that list of potential drivers is a big list, right? Because what's interesting is that on a bodily level, social or spiritual distress actually can translate the same way in terms of inflammatory signaling as gut-based disturbance, right? So the body doesn't discriminate because we are holistic organisms, right? And it all matters. The lowest hanging fruit is probably not, going on some dark night of the soul journey to examine all the skeletons in your spiritual closet, right? Mm-hmm. The lowest hanging fruit is going to be to heal your body. And that's why my bias, even though I have many friends who are shamans and energy healers and walked very different paths in terms of the way they support people, my bias is that if we start with physical healing, often you don't need to dedicate more than an intensive month to that effort before you can really get clear enough to know what are your baseline symptoms, right? Like, are you an irritable person who has insomnia and cloudy thinking? Maybe you're not, actually. Maybe that was just blood sugar disturbance, right? So the dietary recommendations that I make are certainly in line with, what is very familiar to you and your listeners, which is basically to control for inflammatory processed foods, to increase nutrient density, and to essentially begin to relate to food as information, something that connects you to the natural world, to a greater ecology, and to a lineage. So to begin to restore a sacred dynamic, to your diet. I had the privilege of working with and being mentored by Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez in the last year of his life. And for those of you who don't know who he is, in my opinion, he was, the most important figure in modern medicine. I believe that he was able to bring a faith in the potential for healing that was so radical that I'm not sure anyone could stand with him. He had hundreds of cases of complete, long-lasting remission from terminal cancers, hospice-bound patients who were left basically for dead, alive 30 plus years later, and also neurodegenerative conditions, resolving something like Hashimoto's, or even symptomatic bipolar disorder was something he sort of did on the side of these major diagnoses. His approach was really predicated on detox, on personalized nutrition. So this idea that there isn't one diet, there are variations of diet ranging from, fatty red meat twice a day all the way to red meat never. And then personalized, mostly glandular supplementation. And so the point at which I met him in my clinical career was, of course, felt very, divinely ordained to me, because I was at the point where I was seeing these outcomes over and over and over again in my practice with a red meat inclusive diet. I couldn't explain it as a former ethical vegetarian, how this could be possible. I also, as a big Weston Price fan, I also knew that it couldn't be possible that there was just one diet. How could there just be one template? That didn't make logical sense to me, let alone clinical sense. And so in my work with him, with Nick, I was able to understand, that the patients that I work with, so these people who are diagnosed with multiple chemical sensitivity, autoimmunity, depression, hypothyroidism, ADHD, that these patients are what he would call parasympathetic dominant. So he comes from a long lineage of great thinkers, including Pottinger and others. But these are parasympathetic dominants who will only ever get better when they include red meat in their diet. And I don't see the other side of the spectrum typically. So those with diagnoses of, let's say, heart disease or type 1 diabetes, the neurosurgeon, he would say, who, get by on a candy bar all day. My patients struggle with what's called reactive hypoglycemia. So their blood sugar goes all over the place. They're hungry all the time. They're irritable. They can't go 2 hours without eating a meal. These are very different templates that require, different interventions. And the good news is that if you clear the slate of addictive foods, right? So if you clear the slate of processed grains, of processed sugar, if you look at controlling for other inflammatory variables like vegetable oils, and you include food in its whole form, what happens is you begin to want to eat the diet that will heal you. And he always told me that, and I have, that was my personal experience. And I see it over and over again, that you actually know exactly what you're supposed to eat. But we're yanked around, by coffee and alcohol. We're yanked around all day long, and our native perceptual skills are totally clouded over by the addictive nature of some of these foods. So when you control for that, you begin to get clear enough to understand what your baseline is, and then navigating it is something that becomes intuitive in a way you probably never thought was possible before.
I'm glad that you said that our bodies, when we're in tune with them, crave the foods that are going to heal us. Because I was thinking as you were talking, for some people it might seem simpler just to take the medicine the psychiatrist prescribes, because the pill popping is simpler in some ways, especially to the person who's not in tune with their body.
It may seem that way, right? I think, though, the reason that I had a 2-year wait list before I started my online program and made that available and put out a book with my exact, approach and protocol in it, is actually because this model is not working, right? So it's actually leaving people feeling like they may be stabilized somewhat on their prescription, but actually that if they look back, they've been continuously and episodically sick. I have many patients who've been medicated to the gills and have been suicidal almost the entire duration. People struggle with side effects ranging from sexual dysfunction all the way to, liver failure and worse, behavioral, changes that are totally shocking and heinous. But perhaps the most common driver of psychiatric medication taper and discontinuation is actually that people begin to feel like they want to know who they are, right? They want to know who they are off these medications. And when they try to stop them on their own, it can be very difficult. The withdrawal from these meds is very real. It's what I devote my entire practice to. An online platform is supporting people in coming off these medications. And there's a sort of a container within psychiatry that is keeping patients captive, saying you cannot discontinue medication. It's a dangerous thing to do, and you have to take it for life. But the truth is that actually the long-term data really contradicts that assertion. It's a very paternalistic assertion on the part of many psychiatrists, because the data doesn't support that. And that's what Whitaker's book reveals, is that the data suggests, in no uncertain terms, that the longer you're on medication, the more risk of disability you have. Right. So we only study these meds for, basically 4 to 8 weeks, sometimes 12 tops. They have never been studied apart from a handful of naturalistic observational studies for long-term use. Yet we make assumptions, a lot of assumptions in medicine. And one of the assumptions we make is that it's better to do something pharmaceutically than to do nothing, when actually the data suggests otherwise.
Kelly, would this explain why, this is a controversial question, but would this explain why a lot of people who kill themselves or kill other people become really aggressive? Would this explain why those people are not stable even though they're on these meds? So many of them are on these medications.
Yes, exactly. So you've intuited what, sort of became more and more clear to me since I was contacted by somebody named David Carmichael, who's just a regular old guy, right? And he was prescribed Paxil for work-related stress. Shortly thereafter, he strangled and murdered his 11-year-old son. And he is on a mission to raise awareness around this very real possibility of a kind of intoxication that can happen sometimes even within one dose of different psychiatric medications, although there's a fair amount of data on the antidepressant category, that can induce what is called akathisia-related impulsivity. So this is a clinical entity that we know about. We actually know, based on the scientific literature, that people who go on to commit pretty alarming acts of public violence, which can range from a patient coming in and murdering their doctor to someone shooting up a movie theater, that these people, when they are studied, actually have a liver enzyme variant that accounts for the fact that they become essentially intoxicated in a way that is not apparent to them. And what's even creepier is that they look very calm on the outside, but inside they're like consumed with delusions and this sort of sense of crawling out of their skin and this impulsive desire to commit acts of violence against themselves or others. I have another co-activist whose husband was prescribed Zoloft for insomnia, which is weird to begin with, but whatever. And 5 weeks later, he hanged himself in their garage. He'd never been depressed a day in his life, certainly not suicidal. So this is not a rare occurrence, and it is one that is so, at this point, poorly screened for, if screened for at all, that it's one of the reasons I believe all prescribing needs to halt until we have a better understanding, even on a public health level, of what it is that is a possible adverse outcome of even a single prescription of a psychotropic medication.
I'm just thinking that all of this medication is a stab in the dark if what you said is true, that we don't have more than an assessment from the outside without getting the science behind where the levels are in the body that are affecting the person's state of mind. So it really is a crapshoot, and it doesn't sound like the odds are in our favor.
That's exactly it. And so that's why I would say, listen, everyone is entitled to do exactly what feels right to them. And I believe in freedom of choice, informed consent. And, I'm not saying that I want to shut down conventional medicine tomorrow. I believe that people will be attracted to exactly the medicine that's going to work for them at the stage in their life that they're at. But I also think it's important for people to know, whether it's my outcomes or, my colleagues, that there is a safer, potentially more effective way that has innumerable side benefits. And by the way, it's also cheaper, So this is my passion, is to celebrate the very radical outcomes. I have 4 that are being published in peer-reviewed index medical journal right now, 3 of whom I never met in my life, So it's not like the magical voodoo I do in my office in Manhattan. It's really a kind of self-healing that is directed through structured lifestyle interventions. And the kinds of outcomes that I have range from people who put their Hashimoto's or migraines into remission all the way to people who are psychotically suicidal self-injurious. So I have a schizophrenia case. I have very severely disabled people who have gone on to reclaim their, mental health and physical health on levels that are not possible through the conventional model. So we're talking about no side effects and all upside. I believe it deserves some attention.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm thinking, Kelly, we have to do a part 2 because you've talked about the low-hanging fruit of diet. I know you have other ideas on ways we can manage our mental health naturally, like you said, with all the upside. So I definitely want to talk to you again. As we wrap up today, though, I want to ask you the question I often ask my guests. If the listener could just do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
So it's funny because I love to write. I also love to research. And so I will sometimes spend weeks and weeks on a blog article, about a given topical issue, right? And the most viral contribution I have ever made to the internet is what I eat for breakfast, right? So it's literally a smoothie that I made up that does not require any special protein powders or subscriptions to, any kind of product. It's all kitchen-based stuff. And interestingly, there's actually no greens in it. So it's not a green juice. It's not a green smoothie even. And that was another weird thing that I discussed with Nick Gonzalez. It's well, how can I have the feedback that I get on this smoothie is literally ridiculous. It's like a passionate choir of people singing from the audience about how much better they feel. And I couldn't understand that there was no kale in it, right? And of course, the recipe's on my website, but it's very basic. It's cacao and ghee and coconut oil and nut butter and raw egg yolks and coconut water and then whatever frozen fruit you happen to like. I like cherries and then some collagen. So it's basically bone broth, essentially.
Yeah.
And the reason that I think changing your breakfast is sometimes the first step is because it's a really easy early win. And if you are someone who struggles with blood sugar disturbance, which I think is extremely common, particularly in those who've been labeled with depression or ADHD or even anxiety or agitation, irritability, or just people who feel cloudy, right? So they struggle with brain fog, or maybe they're chasing it with coffee all day. The early win can come from a lot of natural fat that serves to stabilize blood sugar. And the feedback I get is that with this smoothie, you feel full for hours longer than you might otherwise. And you have that slower, steadier burn. And so that would be maybe the first intervention.
That is wonderful. I'm going to go get some of those ingredients and pump them into my family. Thank you so much, Kelly, for this conversation. I look forward to talking to you again.
Total pleasure.
My guest today was Dr. Kelly Brogan. To connect with Kelly, go to kellybroganmd.com. For an overview of our discussion and links to resources we mentioned, just go to our website, westinaprice.org, and find the show notes for episode 122. There's even a link to the smoothie that Kelly recommended. If you are enjoying these shows, go ahead and subscribe through Apple Podcasts so you don't miss a thing, and rate and review us there also. Don't forget you can also share the episodes on social media, and you can follow us on Twitter at Weston A. Price and on Instagram at Weston A. Price, and look for us on Facebook, the Weston A. Price Foundation. Next week, we're going to hear from Kelly again. It's part 2 on this fascinating topic. We will explore how to use a combination of factors, including diet, meditation, sleep, and exercise, to shore up our physical and mental well-being. And be on the lookout for a bonus episode that is right around the corner with highlights from our winter journal on hormone health. I want to thank Podcast Village, Rob Ford, and the team of interns for the show: Cynthia Castro-Cohen Enriquez, Joy de los Santos, Elisa Canty, Amy Marvin, and Lily Hanft. Finally, let's stay connected. Look for me at Holistic Hilda on Twitter, at Holistic_Hilda on Instagram, or just visit my website, holistichilda.com. I want to support you on your wellness or podcast journey. Thanks, everybody, and keep listening.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with others. Post a link on Facebook or Twitter, or send a link to a friend in an email, or simply review Wise Traditions on iTunes. Sharing the podcast is one way to spread the important message of health through nutrition. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.